Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? The second sound check for me. It's great to be here. Great to see all of you. I did not quite anticipate this session to be so popular, but I hope we're going to have a good time. My name is Yegor Hanov. I am a Senior Director of Open Platform Engineering at Cerner. Some of you may know who we are. It's an EMR company based in the United States. I've been employed at Cerner for 20 years. It's my first job out of school. I came out and thought I'd try it for a couple of years, and I'm still there. I've worked a lot in the clinical space and some of our clinical solutions, and then as the company grew and adopted new technologies, I moved around a bit, and now interoperability is my space, and I lead the team that builds Cerner's FHIR implementation, smart implementation, and runs our open developer program. Now, the real kicker in all of this for me is that I'm not supposed to be here. So this session is sort of a passion project for a colleague of mine that some of you may have met, Andrew Torres. He's a regular attendee at all sorts of HL7 events. And when we were getting ready to send a couple of people to DevDays, Andrew was going to come do this session, and then I signed him up for one that I usually do on Cerner's developer program. That's this afternoon. And he didn't really want to do it, but he signed up. Well, a couple of weeks ago, he had a life event that kept him from coming here, so I'm subbing in. So in a way, it's karma. I'm doing his session, and then I'm going to do mine. So to me, this feels a bit of a college project type thing, because I had to learn the topic in a couple of weeks from the master, and I hope I can represent it. But take it easy on me if you have real deep questions. So the topic is provenance, and as I started looking into it, I started to try and ground myself of why the seemingly simple concept has been a topic of a lot of passion discussions and conversations through different HL7 events. The implementation guide has some parts in it that are a little bit confusing, so I started with the basics. I looked up at the dictionary to see what provenance means, and right off the bat, there's a little bit of a split in definitions. There's one definition that means it's an origin, it's a source of a thing, and another means that it's a history of all the ownership and all the transitions of how somebody has passed this object around through its lifetime. So obviously, provenance is real big in art world. It has a whole lot of implications in art as far as who the actual artist was, the attribution, whether it was Van Gogh or not, and then who have been the owners. Has this art at any point been stolen? It can have great impact on the value of the piece. I'm sure all of you know the Edward Munch painting that sold for $120 million a few years ago. It has been stolen for a while, and there's been a great deal of debate whether the original is still intact. Now, beyond art, there's a lot of different provenance discussions in science, as far as whether scientific studies that somebody's attributing some conclusions to have come from reputable sources, whether they've been peer-reviewed and thus can be trusted. There's a lot of implications in law and other areas of life. Now, obviously, that's all fascinating, but we're all computer science people. So World Wide Web Consortium has its own view of provenance that's probably a little more relevant to us, and this is the definition that they put forth, focused on really the triple focus of quality, reliability, and trustworthiness of information, and put together this ERD that's really been a sort of one of the sources for the work that HL7 FHIR group has done in provenance space. Now, the interesting thing here, there's a pretty deep set of documents that the W3C produced on the topic, and they're rather dry, but the one interesting thing to us about it is that they really focus that it's not only the what it means to information, but there's different angles you can take at provenance, whether it's agent-centered, who generated a certain piece of data, or who made some updates to it. It could be object-centered, such as if you have a mashup document, or let's say a CDA, where did the components of that come from and what is their provenance? Or it could be process-centered, what sort of workflows, what sort of aggregations of data or transformations of data took place that led to data being in its present state. Now, I am an EMR guy, or EHR guy, I guess, in this case. So as I was learning more about it, I came across some articles that really kind of pointed back at the history. Since I've been working at Cerner for 20 years, I really could correlate to this. So I thought it would be a nice way to sort of set the stage for why we, as healthcare IT professionals, why provenance is so hard for us. So I thought I'd put this together. It's a little bit of fun journey for me. EHR started kind of in earnest in early 80s, maybe late 70s. And the initial focus has been on what we, at least in the United States, call departmental solutions, such as lab, pathology, maybe medication ordering. And due to limitations of technology at the time, you had very little storage to work with. Communications between systems were kind of spotty. Your bandwidth was very limited. So the focus was on making this one department within a hospital work on the computer. There's not a lot of exchange of information electronically at the time. A lot of paper still being used as a medium of exchange of information, but data was being captured. Now, limitations of storage and all those other things kind of led to the fact that we only store what we need. There was not a lot of thought of, once we start exchanging this data, we're going to need to care where it came from, who has impacted it. Now, a few years later, this is kind of when I got involved in the mid to late 90s, the EHR systems grew, storage grew, networks became available, the medical record systems became more patient-centric. They started involving multiple specialties from across the hospital. Multiple end users would contribute to tracking somebody's conditions list or medications list. But still, it was very much sort of a walled castle approach. Healthcare professionals were the only ones with access. So at this point, the data models behind these systems started tracking some elements that were relevant, like who made updates to medication orders, but they're really were more aimed at the end user side, so that you know which of your colleagues made a change to a certain piece of data, and only to some parts, not sort of a first-class provenance type thought. Now, fast forward to where we are today, and this is kind of explosion of devices, whether they're devices used by medical professionals, wearable devices, patients are starting to get involved in their healthcare. There's more data produced by entities outside of just your clinicians. So now we really need provenance. And this is where the work through HL7 FHIRs really come in, and the data model is emerging, and we're really starting to want to track that globally in relevance to all the different bits of clinical data. Now, what's happened through this transition, obviously, there's a lot of things, as I've already referenced a couple, that storage is really no longer a problem. Storage is cheap. There's lots of it. You can put things anywhere you want. Connectivity, bandwidth has grown. Again, that's not really an issue that we deal with as we design systems. The number of participants in the healthcare system is exploding. Again, patients have direct access, and this is going way beyond your typical head count of your clinical staff. Source systems, because of all the connectivity and all the vendors being involved and all the best-in-breed solutions, there's a decent-sized clinical facility will have dozens, if not hundreds, of different applications working together, needing to exchange data. And finally, at least in some areas, regulations have really caught up and are starting to force our hand on some of these areas. So that's sort of the background of where we've come from and why data that has been floating around healthcare system is not always real easy to attribute to a particular agent or process. So now let's move on to the real topic at hand. So why does provenance matter in healthcare? It really boils down to a couple of issues. One is when clinicians are making decisions in regards to somebody's healthcare, they need to know that they can trust the information at hand. They need to know where it came from, how it was generated, and that it's high quality, it's reliable, it's trustworthy. Usually not an issue if it came from within the boundaries of their own institutions. They know what their processes are, how lab tracks things, and who does all the tests, how they're evaluated and documented. But it could be a higher level concern if the information is coming from another institution or self-reported information from a patient or a relative of a patient who is acting on behalf of. So somebody cannot just look at medications list, they need to know how that was documented, how that information was captured. Now there's a second use case, and that is primarily it's manifested once adverse events took place. So a medical error was made, maybe somebody was injured, and if the medical error was made due to untrustworthy information, somebody acted upon a piece of data that turned out to be inaccurate, that becomes a big deal. Obviously, at that point, we need to track down and try to improve process, get to the root cause of where the data came from. So that becomes more of a legal type matter. So the other thing that's important to realize is that not all bits of data that float around medical records are created equal. In terms of provenance, there's really kind of two sides of it. There's data that's measured, it's factual, it's not interpretive, your vital signs captured by a machine, versus data that's more interpretive, conditions that are being assigned to patients as a result of their physical evaluation, diagnosis for, why are you here today? We've looked at you and this is what we think we have. Now, as I was putting this together, the interesting thing happened. I had a physical last week, and the nurse, while taking my vital signs, said, "Oh, they look elevated from last time. Last time, did you get it done by a machine or did the nurse do it?" So even measurements, turns out they have a little bit degree of, there's a difference of how it was captured. I'm okay, my blood pressure was like 2 points over. So in HL7 and Fire, and this is straight from the Provenance documentation page, the definition is somewhat expanded. There's a lot more detail captured, but still the focus here is on authenticity, reliability, trustworthiness, integrity of data, all the things we've just been discussing, knowing with confidence where a piece of information came from, knowing that you can trust it, knowing that you can make decisions on it and do best for your patient. So when you start breaking that down as far as how we document provenance, how you do track provenance, there's really a handful of elements that play sort of a key role. Obviously, you need to know what object you're attributing provenance to. Is it an allergy that was documented? Is it medication? Is it an observation? So that's the FIRE resource. That's the rest of the FIRE spec. Then you need to know who is the author of that information, who documented it, or who the last person who updated it and sort of took ownership of that piece of data. You have to know when it was done. There's probably, with every different piece of clinical data, there's some relevance as to how recently it was captured. Blood pressures probably have a lot less of a shelf life than allergies. So you need to know that data is fresh if it's relevant. And then for some cases, and especially the more legal case of tracking back where the information came from, you need to know a chain of transmitters, where it originated and how it got to where you are today. So in order to track all that down and provide recommendations, there's a number of use cases that the implementation guide goes over. The first couple, they're really simple and they really kind of boil down to the same thing, and that's the direct transmission or HIE redistribution. So HIEs are health information exchange type businesses. So you can think of this is actually in the implementation guide, it's called fax use case, and that is information is transmitted directly. It goes from one system to another. It could be direct message or direct post to a FIRE server. It just came from point A to point B, got saved to database. Nobody curated the information, nobody reviewed it, and there was no change to the actual payload. If an allergy was stored in system A, it came to system B. So clinical content is unchanged here. The original author, the organization where it came from, remain unchanged. Timestamp should be persistent. If the allergy was captured in May 2018, that still is accurate. And transmitter could be deduced by the receiving system because it's a direct connection there. So it could be captured if the receiving system has that ability. It gets a little more interesting with the HIE transformation use case. and this is where the health information exchange may be accumulating data from multiple sources, multiple different types of data. So maybe the HIE itself is getting direct posts to its FHIR server from different facilities. And then HIE is producing an aggregated document like a CDA or CCD downstream to its consumers. So in this case, the information is aggregated. And what's interesting is that for every piece of data that gets sent back downstream from the HIE, some pieces of it should persist, but now you have multiple authors because it's an aggregation of multiple data points. On occasion, HIE itself may become an author of a data set if it includes capabilities to actually aggregate data, do some sort of analysis, and maybe create a calculation. So that new fact would be attributed to the HIE itself in regards to how that information is transmitted downstream to its consumers. And then, I'm having trouble with the clicker here. As a medical record guy, I really can relate to this last use case, which is the actual clinical information reconciliation workflow, where rather than posting information directly to medical record, the sending organization sort of stages the information for the end user to review and potentially accept or reject or maybe modify and accept it. So this is where the clinicians, and in some workflows you can even see it as just when you come in, even outside of these sort of computer systems talking together, if you come in and you first see a nurse and they ask you a series of questions, then the doctor will later come in and basically confirm the understanding of your responses. That's kind of a reconciliation workflow in itself, manual. So in this case, there's a couple of different flavors that the IG covers. There's a more simple use case where there's a single entity that sent the information in. So in this case, a facility called Good Health Organization has a record of patient having a pneumonia documented in January 2018 by Dr. Thompson that gets transmitted to Community Health Organization and gets staged for another clinician to review that information and accept all or parts of it as they see fit, probably as they are, meeting the patient and confirming their understanding of the facts that came in. So in this case, doctor accepted, reconciles the information. He sees that yes, there was pneumonia, patient confirms. So the actual problem, the code itself, gets transmitted over and gets saved as the original source, but the author now becomes doctor accepted because that person took active action on that and recorded in their system. They took ownership of that bit of data because they exercised their clinical judgment now. The original onset date remains, but the recorded date gets updated. So now the information transformed. Later on, if the patient is downloading their medical record in their phone or some other device, somebody else pulls it, what travels forward from that point on is now the updated version of that problem that was modified by doctor accepted and the community health organization. The same scenario could be possible with multiple contributing systems where you have if patient has been around to several places and they reported an allergy that they discovered as a child, for example, based on the implementations of the medical records on those original systems, not all the details may have been captured the same. So when doctor at the Future Health pulls records from previous facilities, they see that an allergy to peanuts comes in from both, but one of them has a reaction documented as hives and the other one has reaction documented as unknown. They also have a different onset date. Now, we don't know at this point if patient reported that differently or that's just an artifact of the underlying system, because each of those systems is backed by its own data model with its own capabilities. We know they can capture allergy, but some of the data obviously varies. So in this case, the doctor at Future Health would have to take a look at that, probably confirm understanding with the patient. And as you see, what gets produced as sort of this next stage of this data is that allergy to peanuts with reaction of hives gets documented, same as what Good Health organization had. Dr. Reconciled, as you'd expect, takes ownership of that piece of data, as well as the organization where he works. Now, the onset date, September 2017, gets pulled from Sunshine Health because that is the accurate based on what they conclude at this next encounter. And the recorded date gets updated to the time when they produced allergy. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
It looks like there's an audit trail here too. So is there a relationship of this resource with the audit?
So the question is whether there is a relationship between provenance and audit. So conceptually, they're sort of close. There's an audit event resource in FHIR, but as you start digging into it, the intended use cases are different. Audit events are intended to be captured at a lot more points in sort of the workflow than provenance. Provenance is geared more on who changed the data, who created the data, how it was transmitted, whereas audit event has a lot to do with privacy and seeing who had access to that data. And so sort of the number of events that you would capture for an audit is broader than what you would care about in provenance. And also the usage of audit would be different. You would expect that whatever audit trails you create within your system, some processor or some person would be regularly looking at those because, again, you're worried about things like breach of privacy. So you would have to at least have some sort of automated tools seeing that appropriate individuals had access to the data. Whereas with provenance, it's more used as needed. If I'm not sure where this came from, I may look into provenance, or if I'm getting sued because I made wrong decision, I may be very interested in provenance at that point, but it's not all the time routinely being reviewed. Yes, sir.
Nevertheless, you need a history track for all these changes made to provenance.
Yes, and we do need history track for provenance for all these changes, but there's a bit of an underlying problem, and I'll get to it in a minute, kind of to the solution. The problem is if you start thinking back to the origins of the medical records, and where I tried to hook you guys, provenance didn't really exist in the same fashion as what we're trying to capture now. So even though we had that sort of modern state, all these devices, everything's communicating to each other, all of that is built on top of existing legacy systems with very spotty records. So we absolutely need to do that, but there's a bit of a compromise in the IG that I'll show you how that was addressed. Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, the first 4 rows on these are the allergy resource, and the reported date is on a different resource, the provenance pointing out the allergy. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, so there's a bit of, and I should have mentioned this a little stronger. When you think about legacy systems and the medical records themselves, even though I've been saying that provenance is not really a first-class thought, but for some of the concept, it's embedded into the underlying concept data models. So for allergies, absolutely, medical records will know who made changes when, and a lot of them will track instances of that, kind of depending on implementation. But from FHIR resources point of view, provenance is its own resource. It refers to another resource such as allergy or condition, but then the tracking of authorship and attribution is within provenance. So I think this is what you were talking about a minute ago. So there is obvious problem between origin of data and sort of the full chain of custody. Full chain of custody may not always be established. And as a system that receives information, my system may not have the capability to actually track all the changes. There has been some discussion about blockchain being perfect for tracking all of this, while existing medical record systems are not really blockchain implementers just yet. So the way that this problem gets addressed in the implementation guide is that the focus is placed on the last hop of the information. As a receiver of it, I need to know who the author was and who was the transmitter. If I know those two things, I can go back to the transmitter and see what they have, if that's the original place where the information came from, or if they had a transmitter of their own. So you can kind of retroactively go back up the chain to find all the hops, as long as everybody is tracking at least one transmitter. Does that make sense? Now, this is obviously a pain if you had to do that in practice, but hopefully this is the kind of pain that's only really relevant in the scenarios of liability, which should be rare. So the implementation guide, in addition to those use cases, spells out some fairly straightforward basic recommendations, such as the author organization shall be captured when a piece of data is being authored. Whoever, if you're working in one place, that's the place that is being tracked along with your name. If the data is being exchanged without change, original author, time step, and organization persist. I'm not going to read through all of these. You guys can do that pretty well. Okay. And
before you continue, what
yes.
IG are we actually talking about?
The implementation guide for the proposed, I think it's the Argonaut implementation guide that that links off of the Provenance webpage in R4. Sorry, should have made that clear. Yes.
So supposing the author is the patient via a patient app.
Right.
So this one says that it has to be the health system or clinic.
Yep.
Supposing the original author is a patient themselves, it's patient-generated data, or a patient reported outcome that comes from a tool outside of the clinic.
So the question was, if the author is the patient and it's patient-generated data, how would organization be attributed? So in my experience, when we work with patient-generated data, it does not go directly into the medical record. It gets staged for review and reconciliation by a provider. At that point, provider takes ownership and the provider organization gets stamped as the authoring organization of Provenance.
But does the original step include the patient original? So the very start of that chain, does it not start the patient?
The spec makes provision for it, but I think that specific matter would be up to implementation of the system that accepts patient-generated data. Okay, and I think we've already covered this, that when you have multiple authors acting upon data within an institution, the system should provide a way to track the changes, and the latest author will be the one for transmission purposes. Now within FHIR, there's a FHIR-specific best practice, since not all resources are always guaranteed to be codified and have real IDs. If a free text provider is sent, then the system shall provide the transmitting organization as the author organization, because that is the way you can link back to where information came from and have better chance of identifying the actual provider within the realm of that system. So in the United States, there's pending regulation right now that will make Provenance one of the resources that every EMR provider has to implement. The regulation went to final draft just earlier this month, and we expect it to be finalized within the next 60 to 90 days. It's basically just being marked up now. All revisions are finished. Now, the provenance is defined very narrowly as just the author organization and the timestamp. And it's part of the expanded USCDI resource set. If you're familiar with the United States regulation, there was a meaningful use regulation a couple of years ago that specified core clinical data set resources. USCDI adds a handful of resources, including Provenance, to the listing that everybody must implement. So I will be implementing that soon. Now, the US core profile that's defined on top of Provenance resource goes a little bit beyond than what USCDI requires, in that the profile actually does provide for transmitter and transmitter organization. It also includes a specific recommendation on how to fetch provenance for a specific resource. So if you want to query for allergies and find out provenance for all of the resources coming back, you would use a rev include parameter with provenance as a target, and that way the querying server would have to return allergies and the record of all the provenances associated with them. And finally, going back to our discussion of the chain of custody, the profile makes a specific recommendation that transmitter and author have to be implemented as the first two spots in the agent field, and then you can create additional tracking of all the agents that may have had possession of the data ahead of time, but those are not required, those are optional. And with that, I am done. Any questions?
Do you
Yes,
have
sir.
a link to the implementation guide that you mentioned? Is it the basic provenance implementation guide?
Yes, that's the one. Yeah, I can share it. I do have it. I should have included there, I guess.
We have a search engine.
Okay.
Find it.
All right.
Do you know if the Apple Health Kit implementation complies with this at the moment?
I do not know. I've seen some colleagues from Apple walking around here earlier. I think that would be a question for them.
So how is Cerner doing on that?
We do not have provenance implemented yet. We're working on it right now. So our R4 services will include provenance. Should be getting released in the next 2-3 months. So we're trying to get a little bit ahead of USCDI.
So can I just get a question to the room? How many have actually implemented provenance resources in their implementation? Okay. Cool. Thanks.
We're behind. Yes, sir.
Is there any thoughts on how you should flow provenance to multiple steps? And can you pass the provenance resource along with the resource and then chain them together almost, rather than just building a really big one with all the previous authors in?
I do not know. I haven't got into that side of the implementation myself yet. Maybe one of the implementers can answer that. Whoever raised their hands before. Anybody? No? I think you were first.
You mentioned reliability as a use of provenance. Do you have, I don't see any mention of that on the properties of the resource. Do you have any examples or where that
I have to agree with you on that. As I went through that, I kind of wondered that myself. The definition is very expansive, but the actual resource implementation is very focused on this small set of attributes that have to be passed around.
Well, I would say trustworthiness is more like a business decision. Let's say if you were to receive some observation from a totally unknown source, let's say from some very different country that you know nothing about, you will assign yourself as the receiver a lower level of trustworthiness to it than if it was done by somebody in your own organization.
Right.
It's not something you would store or send that I am very trustworthy. Well, that's up to me to decide.
Right.
So to me, it's not an attribute, but the use case is very much there.
And I think reliability, at least my view of it, is a little bit different than trustworthiness. But I agree with the trustworthiness point that as a system owner, I probably would not even accept a transmission from an unknown resource from an unknown country, because for that specific reason, I'd have no trust.
Do we create provenance record for every resource that's created in the system, or it's only for observations or encounters like that?
So are you speaking as a fire server who receives information? So
Yeah, so when you, suppose I create an observation in a fire server,
Mhm.
then there's a provenance record created for that observation.
it would depend on your implementation. The way we're going about it is we are going to expose a provenance post as a separate resource. So if somebody transmits provenance to us, or we require them to transmit provenance, it would come in as a separate payload from observation or allergy or anything else. Now, we are implementing provenance right now. across a number of clinical spaces, pretty much matching what the rest of USCDI is going to be, so medications, observations, allergies, and so on, but it's not by any means an exhaustive list of every single resource will include provenance for us. Yes?
It seems like that every vendor can implement its own mechanism to define its authors and organizations. To what extent should you advise to use coding systems to identify organizations, authors across organizations?
Well, having something codified through OIDs or some other means is always preferable to passing free text, but that's kind of going back to even with free text, you have to pass an organization to establish this is the transmitter to be able to determine where that came from and who the practitioner is if you have to go back to it. Now, it's hard to track an exhaustive list of all organizations in the world. So there is a piece of what I'm involved in as far as interoperating our Cerner systems with others, that as you make more connections, as you establish more partners, whether it's their app vendors or other systems, you have to keep configuring the system to account for additional identifiers for these systems or who may be calling you.
Yeah, so it actually depends on the use case and how
Right.
much
Right, and at least in the United States, there's no global catalog of providers or organizations, so we kind of struggle with that from time to time, and it depends on configuration. Yes, sir?
What about the relationship between the provenance and the device used to source the information, such as, for example, a workstation, and I think also other devices. I'm thinking not to medical devices, actually, but other devices such as, for example, I don't know, voice recognition or text translation during reporting phases, for example, or something like this. Should this be a part of should this be an instance of the WHO element in the provenance resource or something else?
That's an interesting point, and I'm not a deep specialist on devices, but I have had some exposure to labs where there's apparently some sensitivities to what equipment is used to capture a certain measurement. So it's an interesting thought. I don't know how it is addressed within what we've put together so far.
So you mentioned that in the processing pipeline, intermediary, they update or create a resource, they take responsibility for that. In your experience, is there a way to track, for example, when I'm consolidating information from multiple sources? Like this bit of information is coming from organization A and this bit is coming from organization B. Is there a way in your experience to track that composition or that transformation beyond just now I'm taking ownership of this piece of data, but this piece of data is actually coming from different upstream organizations?
Yeah, in the case of aggregating a number of different resources, I think that was our HIE aggregator use case. You're not taking ownership of unchanged resources. You're only taking ownership of the things you yourself created. So as if you're putting a CDA together and you form it based on information that came from multiple sources, the provenance of individual components will still stay with them. You're not taking ownership over that.
On the medication order, we're going to have an enterer, a signer, and a nurse verifier.
You could.
Pharmacist verifier.
Yes.
Is there any guidance or constraint from the spec on which one of those becomes the author, or is that a business decision?
I think it's a business decision of the medical records system. So in our case, it's the ordering provider. It's not the pharmacist or the nurse. And I think I got the sign. We're up on time. Thank you all very much. I'll hang out here a few more minutes if you want to stay and chat, and enjoy the rest of the conference.